You're listening to the Emissary Authors podcast, where we help faith-driven founders and entrepreneurs tell the stories that matter. This episode was made possible in part by the Emissary Author Workshops and our title of the week, The Hope of War, from Emissary author Larry Cripps. Go to publishwithemissary.com/workshops and thehopeofwar.com for more details. You're listening to the Emissary Authors podcast, where we help faith-driven founders and entrepreneurs tell the stories that matter. This episode was made possible in part by the Emissary Author Workshops and our title of the week, The Hope of War, from Emissary author Larry Cripps. Go to publishwithemissary.com/workshops and thehopeofwar.com for more details. Well, it is another exciting episode of the Emissary Authors podcast. Paul Edwards, along with my partner in crime, my friend, my colleague, Jason Todd, the one and only. And we have an episode for you today that I think is going to challenge you a little bit because we're going to talk about some of the key ingredients that you really need to find success and momentum as a published author. But we're bringing it from perhaps a slightly different angle. Our guest today is David Osk, who's a friend of mine, the colleague and associate through the Iron Sharpens Iron Mastermind. He owns a business. He's based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and he is working on his second book, which is, oh shoot, I'm drawing a blank on the title now. The
Guardians of Grit.
Guardians of Grit. And David maintains that there's a difference between resilience and grit. So let's find out what that is. Let's bring him on. David Osk, welcome to the Emissary Authors podcast, my friend. How are you?
Gentlemen, I'm glad to be here. I'm doing well today. Thanks for having me on.
Happy to have you. Now, you are unique in that your first book was written for children.
Yeah.
An illustrated children's book. And then your second book is written for fathers. And some people take the kids' book path. Some people take the adult path, but few people bridge the two.
Man, I tell you what was interesting is really for most of my life, I had thought about, being an author someday, right? Wasn't necessarily sure what I would even write about. And my friend Paul DeBrito had a business book published with Taylor and Seal Publishing probably a few years before, I did. And he asked me, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, yeah, I'm not quite sure what I would write about. And he challenged me in that moment. He said, David, you need to write. He said, I want to challenge you. And when you have a book that's, you think might be, worth writing or an idea, I'll introduce you to, Dr. Custerary and so on. Well, what was interesting is a few days later, I'm, laying in bed. This is when my kids were younger. We did every night, and I would tell them a little story about two little British mice named Fire and Ice, and I'd make up a story on the fly. And it always started out with, Fire and Ice are two mice who are very nice. They always look for spice, and they never think twice, and they love to roll the dice. And so I've got two little rascals who are sitting in the bed with me, and my wife walked by one day and she goes, you might want to start writing those down. They're getting kind of good. Well, I didn't tell her about my conversation with Paul. So the next morning got up and I wrote down one of my stories. It was the one I, of course, kind of told the night before, really on the fly. And I recorded it into, my phone, and I, made a PDF and I sent it to Paul. He sent it to, the publisher. And like 2 days later, I got a phone call and they just said, we really like this, would you want to have a conversation? And we were kind of off to the races there. So it was a bit of a curveball, really. At the time I hadn't thought about it. That was 5 or 6 years ago. And then this past year, I've been really feeling, a real sense of mission to men, mainly to fathers. And, I don't want to get too, into the weeds here, but we all know what happens, when men don't lead, right? on a macro and a micro level. Everything rises and falls on leadership. In fact, I would argue that and this is by no means disrespecting women. I think they're better people than we are. But when men fail to lead, everybody loses. When men lead well, everybody wins. And you would never hear a child or a wife say, ever, boy, I wish my husband didn't lead so well.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's just the opposite, right? The sigh, right? The sigh in a woman's voice or a child even, they might not even have the courage to vocalize it, but they would long, for their dad to step up and to love and lead with courage and nobility and lead with clarity and a strategy. So not to get too long-winded here, but over the last couple of years, I've been working with Dr. Andy Garrett around, what he calls the True North Blueprint. And it really helps people just build self-awareness. What is it that lights you up? What is it that makes you tick? And to build a framework, around that, your uniqueness, right? We all have a fingerprint and a retina scan, if you will, and a soul print that is really, really different. And when men remove that big question mark, right? When they build that sense of clarity, when they walk into the room and they've predetermined, they've labeled who they are and who they're not, and the impact that they want to have, the things that they're going to say yes to and no to, the things that light them up. I like to say, by the way, the things that give your goosebumps, right? What are you willing to suffer for, right? That word passion. It's amazing what starts to shift in a man's life. But then, what if, and we all do, what if your kids are struggling? And I don't care if they're 8 years old or they're 18, right? Avoidance, apathy, anger, depression, anxiety. They're just that sin of comparison everywhere they go. And of course, they need to look to their parents. That's what their parents are there for, is to raise, not just provide for, but raise. I'm talking raise young people. But guess what? Most men, they not only don't have a clue how to do that, they have no even reason why they even woke up in the morning. I mean, and I know that sounds kind of bleak, but I think the proof is in the pudding. If you look around, we're falling apart at the seams, right? Men want to be girls, girls want to be men, and now we got teenagers wanting to be animals, literally. So I know that sounds rather dramatic and all this stuff, right? I don't care. Yeah. I'm on a mission to paint a noble, good paradigm for fathers to institute and implement immediately into their own lives and that of their children. People like us do things like this. When you've predetermined, right, not just some stupid credo on the wall, but when you've predetermined those things that are valuable, noble, and precious and good, and you start pouring that kind of stuff into your family, get ready for things to get really good.
Yeah. Well, before we delve deeper into this, I think, important topic that you're talking about, I want to highlight for our listeners and viewers the two directions that you have brought up in book writing.
Yeah.
The first one is something I just think about as pull through. You're doing something and people ask you for more of it. And it wasn't something that you thought, I got to get this message out there. You're just doing it in the normal course of business. And like in your case, hey, I am just talking to my kids. And somebody else says, hey, you know what? Have you ever thought about, right? And at that I talk about pull through. You don't have to cast it out there and pressure people to take your message. They're asking for it anyway.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And then the second thing I'm thinking about in regard to this message to men is a message that you must share, and you are going to talk about it in some way, whether they like it or not. Those, I think, are two very distinct paths. What has it been like for you as you're approaching this second book versus the first book?
Well, of course, the first book was just whimsical and fun, right? It was almost more of a dare. And at the same time, to have that moment with my kids and our neighbors' kids and my nephews and, the 9 people that bought the book, it was, it was really fun. And but right now though, like, this is missional to me. I'm not writing a book because I want people to call me an author. I don't care about that. I'm writing a book because there's a message that is just near and dear to my heart. And I want dads, to, by the way, my favorite quote as of late is by Benjamin Disraeli. He's a former PM of England back in the 1800s. And he said, the greatest good you can do for another is not to share with him your riches, but to reveal to him his own.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the greatest ways through the paradigm of grit and resilience to look at your kids and say, let me introduce you to yourself so that you, in and of yourself, can become gritty and resilient. And so I think that for me, where the first book was just fun, right? This is way more. I'm looking to the future, and I feel like I'm well more on a mission than I am just trying to write something about myself, which is fine too if I had more of an interesting life. But
yeah, I hear it distinctly, and just having some familiarity with Dr. Andy Garrett and the background work that went into what he's brought forth, and the close relationship the two of you formed working on that. Gives me insight, not visible or audible on this podcast, obviously, but insight into the direction you're taking people when they interact with that.
Yeah.
It's a very, very good one. It's one that says, much like we often tell authors, if you want to write a book because you think that you're going to make a bunch of money,
yeah,
or if that's your primary motivation, you're in for a disappointing experience.
Mm-hmm.
And we quite honestly don't want to be blamed for that. So we're going to pass on publishing you with our label, right? It's not to say that we are willy-nilly about the whole concept of recouping the cost of your investment. That's very sound business principle. But at the same time, if you are if you're pinning your hopes on that, you're in big doo-doo.
Yeah. And Paul, I hope I answered your question there. With regard, I hope I answered your question. If you want to follow up on that too, I'm happy to dive a bit deeper there too. So,
which question did I ask?
Well, I'm sorry, Jason, not Paul. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. You had asked, this kind of this idea of, pull through, I think you said, and I just want to make sure that I understood that correctly as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about that, Dave, what would you say? Like you're talking now to, somebody who has potential to read your book, and you're describing, you're trying to get across the, one of the things you mentioned that we're going to talk about is that there's a difference between resilience and grit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I was going with my commentary there is, in a very similar format, we tell authors, it's resilience and grit on your part as the author, even way more than us as the publisher, that is going to propel that book. We're not trying to do the whole bestseller thing here. We're trying to get it into the hands of the people who need to know it. And whether that's 500 people or 500 million people is irrelevant. So
how about this? So inside of this, the paradigm of being an author, right? Well, let me paint a bit of a picture and how grit and resilience can play in here. So say you have a continuum of, 0 to a -10 and then 0 to a +10, right? Mm-hmm. I almost feel like this, and it's been this experience for me, is the negative side, if you will, is writing the book. And why? Because it's hard. Yeah. Right. Every single day, I sit down to write and I'm like, was that any good? Was that just a bunch of nonsense? You've got imposter syndrome. You've got, just that head game. And of course, on a very basic level, right? Hey, this is something else I'm throwing into my world that is quote unquote work. If you want to write a book, you can't just willy-nilly your way into it. It's you got to have a disciplined time that you're going to sit down and write. So I actually got a coach. I've got a book accountability partner. So we have to log our time every single day, 7 days a week. And so there's that side of, so with regards to resiliency, there is, it's almost like, you're getting knocked down. So resiliency is what? It's getting knocked down. It's getting punched in the face or whatever, right? And springing back to where you were. And of course, that word kind of implies getting up more quickly. If I'm a resilient person, right, I can get knocked down, if you will, and get up quicker. So there's less downtime. Mm-hmm. And of course, the ROI there, right, very literally financially and otherwise, is realized. The longer you stay down, and I mean, it kind of compounds. Mm-hmm. So then when I think about grit, though, I'm thinking, okay, that 0 to a positive 10, my buddy Glenn made the comment the other day, grit is for under your feet. It's like you've got traction, but mm-hmm. it's this idea of I'm moving to that positive side and I'm willing to push through hard things, right? Get out there and talk about it and sell it and do those things, because what I believe on the other side is worth fighting for. Yeah. And here's what's fascinating, though, is if you jump inside of each of those paradigms, what is it? Like, what's the genesis of it? I mean, truth of the matter, you can have extrinsic genesises, if you will, or motivations, right? I mean, I might want to be famous. I might want to make a lot of money. I might want this external, applause or stimulus. And even on the resilient side, right, I might want to just get up quicker so I don't look like an idiot or look like a loser. But here's what I think is really fascinating when you understand. All right, I'm going to get kind of deep here for a second. So authenticity, where do we get that word? Author. Comes from the word author. I didn't make me, right? I didn't choose my eye color. I didn't choose my taste buds. I didn't choose my personality. I chose nothing. And those of us who have children know they come out of the gate very hardwired. Me and my siblings were incredibly different. Parker and Kate are really different. And when they're young, they're not thinking about being authentic, right? They're doing their deal. They're not conscious observers of themselves. They're just, hey, don't touch that. Or, I'm going to go write a song and I'm going to go play with guns and I'm going to go, they're just doing their deal. So here's what's fascinating, though, is when you understand that I need to start identifying who I am. That's identity. You've identified authorship. No pun intended here. So in general, you start identifying what is it that gives my goosebumps? What is it that makes me mad that I'm willing to fight for? What am I passionate about? What are my strengths? What are my convictions, my values, the virtues I want to impart? What is that David Osk shaped dent in the universe? You can shift from an extrinsic motivation to an intrinsic motivation where you've got kind of clean fuel. And the fuel is this: when you step out in your own authenticity and identity, right? And you act in accordance with what you have defined as you, it feels good. It feels authentic. It feels genuine. So that word authenticity, right, starts with authenticity, but it gives you a sense of authority in your life, as opposed to that big stinking question mark that you have inside of your heart and head, when you don't quite know, and you've got imposter syndrome, and you walk into a room and you're just kind of scared and you're comparing yourself to everybody. You're driving to some, big function or whatever it is, and you're second guessing yourself and all that kind of thing. What happens is when you've predetermined, right, here's who I am, here's who I'm not, people like me do things like this, you get to those places and you're on mission, right? You're looking for the loneliest person in the room. You're looking for, just to make a friend, as opposed to, will somebody please come over here and tell me that I'm great and start asking me questions because I'm so scared. I started implementing these things with my kids when they were young, and I'm talking, 5 years old. When Parker went to, Bright Horizons preschool down here, and he didn't want to, first 4 or 5 days, he's crying when we left, and, kind of normal, right? But I flipped the switch in that kid one day, and I looked at him and I said, Parker, this is not about you, son. You're on mission here. There's lonely kids here. I want you to go find the loneliest person in the room and make a friend, ask him questions. It changed everything got him, building authenticity and identity is not staring at our own belly buttons, right? It's unto and into purpose. Purpose is everything. So with regards, I'll jump back into the author thing here, right? When you understand intrinsic motivation, the who, man, it's amazing how much faster you get up, because people like me do things like this.
Yep.
As well as pushing through gritty, like pushing through rejection, pushing through, hey, can I come and speak to your group on this topic? Nope. All right. I'm going to go ask somebody else. Why? Because the mission is clear and it's critical, and I believe in it. Yep. And I believe in my capacity to communicate something that's powerful and can change lives.
One of the things that's standing out for me in what you talked about is, as you talked about grit, I heard friction.
Oh, yeah.
And when you talked about resiliency, I heard what comes right before the need for resiliency is no friction at all. If you get knocked down, you're just sitting there, and you could sit there an awfully long time, and it tends to feel good in an ironic way, yeah. Right? Like, well, I don't have to do anything today.
Yeah.
It doesn't require or doesn't create friction when you're just sitting there crying in your soup. Yeah. So when you get back up, that process of resiliency puts you back into a place of friction. And I wonder if friction is the evidence of something. What would you connect that to?
That's a really great question. What's funny, when you first said that, the thing that I thought of was when, like, for instance, on your hands, right? You go to the gym, you start lifting, right? That friction, you start building calluses, you start, framing a house or whatever you're doing. Part of that friction, I'll be honest, is developing a tougher skin. It's guess what? I'm not so thin-skinned anymore. So the grit, like sandpaper, right? That friction, it creates a bit of armor. And I think that, it's like salty and sweet, right? You can't have one without the other. Resilience, requires friction, right? Or a punch in the face, or whatever you want to call it. And it's, so it's, I think sometimes we would want to, and I do this, by the way, I just poo-poo things that are hard. Oh, it's hard. I don't want to do this. And why does everything have to be so difficult and all that kind of thing? But guess what? It creates a stronger version of you.
Yeah.
Those are very, very real emotional, right? Spiritual, mental muscles that we start to develop. But you can't develop those things unless you have that friction there. So anyway, some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah. Pressure makes diamonds.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just funny that you're saying that you guys are saying this right now, Dave, because there's just some long range thoughts I was having in response to a recent pull through for me, without going into details because it has not yet fully materialized. But the invitation was to be a co-author.
Okay.
In a project. Now, here's the rub. The co-authoring of this particular project intertwines like 4 out of 4. If I had, I'm just picking the number 4. It could be 5. It could be 10. It doesn't matter. I get straight across the board light up of every single thing that matters the most to me. Like every single thing I've ever dreamed of writing about, spent years researching, reading, understanding, thinking about, meditating on. All this experience and all this intellectual and spiritual force I have to bring to bear on this. And it's extremely risky.
Yeah.
It is. It's like, because of course I think about, if I'm going to put my name on something, then I view myself as responsible as well to promote it.
Oh man. Tell me. Yeah. Yeah.
Which would be fine if I was promoting, power of positive thinking.
Yeah.
Right? That's fine. But we're talking about material here that in some instances can make people want to, pull out rocks and throw them at you. And I'm thinking, do I really want to be involved in that? Do I want to, get out there and start having my reputation assailed by people and all of that? I'm pretty good at keeping a low profile these days. And yet it beats so intrinsically within my chest. It circulates hour after hour in my head. I cannot get uninterested in it.
Yeah. Man.
I mean, I hope when the audience sees and hears this, right, you're seeing what it sounds like to be driven intrinsically to spread a message that you cannot. I don't want to die without having said this, and yet I could even die for saying it.
Wow.
You know, so
I think it goes back to the idea of grit, like we just talked about, and David brings up that grit and friction are an indicator that you're doing something.
Yeah.
You know what's funny as you were talking about that, I forget who first said it, but there's the phrase where he says, "I'm often wrong, but I'm never in doubt," and I love that idea, right? This humility of, okay, get over yourself. Of course you're wrong. At the same time, be a person of substance. Don't shrink because somehow you think you're going to get chastised. I think I'll be honest. I think that the one of the scariest things about writing, about this topic and trying to communicate these really what I think are eternal, type truths, right? Truth claims is, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm missing a little piece or I nuance something, in a way that is, just heck, I didn't know how I was saying something, and I don't even believe what I said. I just didn't know how to say it right. Just ignorance, that kind of thing. Or even, toward the beginning of our call, right? You start talking about things that are kind of political hot button issues, and what if I come across like a total jerk? Well, guess what? When I'm talking about situations in our world that just stink. They've got a big question mark around them. Things that I probably, I would disagree with. Well, part of grit and part of resilience is looking in the mirror first, right? And understanding I'm often wrong. I like this idea of never in doubt because I don't care if I get corrected. I'll just pivot. I like new information. If I'm wrong and I realize it, well, guess what? I'll write another book.
Yeah.
Again, there's something below all of that. And for me personally, right, when I've understood my authenticity, it's grace. It's absolute, stunning, ridiculous, extravagant grace. And I don't have to have it all together. I don't have to be perfect. In fact, I never will. So I think that there's a way to, have difficult conversations, write about difficult things, and do them with, a sense of mission, masculinity, authority, and yet, have open hands around it. I sure wouldn't want people to think if I'm talking about something I disagree with and, that I hate them or something like that, right? I don't want to communicate that. That's not me because I'm probably more of a screw up than they are. But what I want to communicate is I believe there is a plumb line. I believe there is true north. I believe there is a fixed point. This idea of magnetic north versus true north. That's something Dr. Andy talks about. Magnetic north, like a compass, right? You're going to get close, but true north, try living without that.
Yeah.
Right? You think, oh, this is what I believe. But unless you've really drilled in, and with radical clarity, you're not going to be resilient. You're not going to have grit. You're going to suffer from imposter syndrome, apathy, avoidance, fatigue, anxiety every single time you try to put yourself out there, or you try to lead your own children for that matter, because you don't even know what you believe.
Yeah.
And I would much rather, right, my children, as I'm leading them, lead with clarity, kindness, grace, and conviction. That beautiful ball of, okay, guys, we're going this way because I'm the dad and I'm going to lead. I might be wrong, but guess what? If I'm wrong, we'll pivot tomorrow. But I'm not going to not do something, and I'm not going to leave, some stupid gray area here. There's too much at stake.
Yeah.
So I think that, there's an undercurrent of grace, self-awareness to understand truly, as in human form here, understand resiliency and grit.
Yeah.
Well, the struggle that I hear in all of this, not only what you're bringing up, David, when you're talking about being a father and being a man and leading, but connecting that to what Paul's is talking about with, do I say these words essentially?
Yeah.
Do I put this out there? One of the great tasks of all fathers is to be able to tell their kid something that the child does not want to hear.
Yeah.
And is definitely going to argue about. And yet it needs to be said. It needs to be delivered in such a way that the end result is coming together. But even if it takes a bit for that child to accept it, it has to be done. It has to be said, because we're looking 20 years out, not 2 days out.
Yeah, I love that. And you're right. I mean, when the rubber meets the road, boy, you better have the conviction and the leadership ability to step up. Here's something else though, too, is, and this is one of the reasons I want to go after dads. I love being a dad. And you know what? I think I've earned the place in my children's life through, I'm hoping, humility, right? Through extravagant love. I mean, even to this day, my son is 18. He's 220 pounds solid muscle. And he's in his second semester of college now. But when Parker comes home, I wrap my arms around him. I kiss him on the cheek. I grab him by the face. I put my forehead on his forehead. And I'm like, dude, I love you. What's up? I'm glad you're mine. I've done that with him since day one. My dad did that with me. And so I think that, what I don't want to communicate is this raw, fatherhood, masculinity, dads, you have to lead better. No, you had better be self-aware enough of your own idiocy, right? Dostoevsky says that humans, we're a mixed bag of contradictions every single day. So I think that if you don't walk with that paradigm, right? Being able to laugh at yourself, look at yourself, and at the same time have really strong convictions, your children are going to look at you like, Dad, I see all of your bull crap. Don't act like it's not there.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to. And that's where grace is amazing, right? And so I think that you can walk in the full weight, right? Warts and all of who you are. Lead with deep conviction, teach resiliency. I like this idea, by the way. We kind of laugh at this idea of, well, I'm pushing a rope uphill. Most parents feel that way with their kids. I mean, they're bribing them. If you get these grades, you get money. I mean, if you don't study, I'm taking your phone away. If you all this kind of nonsense. Well, what would it look like to sit down with your children on a real regular basis and to start mining for gold? Hey, tell me what you think about this. What kind of a person do you want to be? What is it that lights you up when you walk out of a test and, how do you want to feel about that? Well, I don't care. Well, guess what? They don't care because they're scared. It's not that they don't care. Of course they care. That's why they have so much emotion around it. So emotional intelligence, self-awareness in a family starts with the dad, right? Even in marriage, my buddy Quentin Hafner, who's a great author, he said, he asked this big group of men. He speaks to all kinds of men's groups and just asked, what's the number one thing that your wife needs from you? And they were rattling off all this stuff about communication and all that kind of thing. And he said, nope, it's self-awareness and humility. Because then communication, right? If you're a really good communicator, you can communicate your way around anybody and just talk circles around them and be a bully. But if you lead with conviction, with humility, with self-awareness, right? That transparency, like, hey, people like me, I do things like this. And I know I'm not perfect, but guess what? Dad is here. Dad speaks with conviction and authority, tries to say what's true in love. And nobody's going to reject that. They might reject the dad that speaks with authority and speaks what is true because he's an a-hole, right? But I mean, let's get real about it. There's a lot of parents or kids, teenagers that roll their eyes at their children, at their parents for good reason, because their parents have been dictators and not human. And so when I'm talking about grit and resilience, I want to paint a picture here that isn't a system. It's a change of heart. It's a change of everything that you know, not only about yourself, but about how to really love somebody.
Really good stuff, Dave. I'm looking forward to reading this.
I'm hoping I can pull it off. So truth of the matter is, the last 3 days, let's get real about writing a book. I've sat down to write and I'm like, I got nothing to say.
Hmm.
It's fascinating as, as I'm sitting here talking with you guys, I'm seeing your faces, right? I can tell that you're engaged. You guys care about stuff. And of course, Paul, I've known you to know that you're a good and kind and noble man. So I feel safe to kind of talk about these concepts, but it's amazing, right? You get up in the morning and it's 4:30 and that's my time to write. And I'm all alone. I'm like, oh no, it's the imposter. It's maybe that self-imposed punch in the face, right?
Mm-hmm.
That self-doubt. And I need to harness resilience. Part of the reason I'm writing this, guys, is because if I don't, if I don't teach it, if I don't write it, I don't harness it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I might have to go back and listen to this podcast and start writing down some things that I said, because in the moment, right, when my heart is excited and full, these things come out of me in a way, that might not on paper. And that, by the way, that's a whole nother topic with regards to different modes of writing. How do some people actually get their passion out? It's really different for, various writers.
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind in that is the process of resiliency and grit that you've connected us to. In that moment when it's 4:30 in the morning, you are hoping for sunrise to come. It's sitting alone, perhaps. I can sense where you're at.
Oh man!
And I remember when I was writing my book, I began a chapter describing the coffee shop that I was in and the people who were walking by, to bring the person into the chaos of settling down into my thoughts. And I did it on purpose, not because I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was trying to be real. And I don't remember what the chapter was in where I started that, but I remember when I sent it to Paul, who was coaching me through my writing.
Yeah,
it was a topic of discussion, and I can see a chapter or a part where you start and you are inviting us to sit there with you as men in the early morning as you lead your household in that moment. Early riser, everybody else is asleep. You are now processing the things that this family needs from you, that only you can give it. Yeah. When no one else is awake.
I had by the way, there's a friend of mine, I haven't seen her in quite some time, Sue Buchanan. She's written like very, very kind of famous children's books. And she told me one time, David, just write. It might not even go in the book, but everything, that is kind of boiling up in you needs to come out.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, by the way. I don't consider myself a fiction writer by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I wrote the little kids book, but that's a totally different story there, as it were. And so the other day I sat down and I started writing, and you know what came out was a little chunk of a paragraph about a toy store and a toy maker. And by the end of that story, and I'd be happy if we have time, I'll read the paragraph to you. By the time we got to the end of that story, I realized that the mission for me is not about building resilience for people and grit and self-awareness so that you can feel safe, so that you can stare at your own belly button forever and create your little perfect world. It's purpose. If you haven't built that sense of identity and stuff unto and into purpose, right? What is your mission? What dent are you having? You have not found it. Everything was made for a purpose. Maybe not wasps, but everything else was. Insects, fire, water, blades of grass, trees. Every single creature was made for something.
Yeah.
And I really believe that my mission here is not, I want to, if you get knocked down, to get back to zero, and okay, let's push through some hard things. I want you to find out what it is that just completely lights you up so that Paul, it's what you were talking about. You can't avoid it. It's always on your mind. What is that thing? And it might be writing songs. It might be being a mom, right? I don't care. You get to identify that. It's none of my business. And by the way, 10 years from now, it might be something different. We kind of change and grow. But when I wrote the little paragraph about the toy store, I got to the end of it and I realized that I had just written a fictitious story about my mission.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me, I don't know what you're thinking, Paul, but David, if you wanted to read that paragraph, it seems like maybe that would be a fitting close.
Okay.
To this episode.
Okay. Well, let me take a stab at it here. So you're an orphan teenager and you're standing in the alley that happens to be your home. Your home is made of pallets, some old tin roofing and filthy blankets. You've been there for quite some time. It's drizzling outside and you're very cold inside and out. You're looking in the side window of a beautiful toy store. And when I say beautiful, I want you to picture the most beautiful store you've ever imagined. Beautiful stained wood beams, gleaming stone floors, lights that almost dance. Toys that are larger than you and music playing, people laughing, workers whose faces show that they're more on a mission than at work. This is the place to be except for you. You stand in the cold, dark alley next to the side window, hoping not to be seen. Your clothing is dirty, torn, and unacceptable. And you are filled with sadness masked by rage. But even that rage is just a flickering light. You are done. You have nothing left. As you stand in the cold, dark alley, you glance in the side window. That night, the toy maker sees you and makes eye contact with you. You recoil in fear back into the night. But that night, you can't sleep. You keep thinking about the expression on the toy maker's face. You've never seen an expression like that on anyone's face. It was as if he knew you, and that curious smile he had was an invitation to Christmas dinner, and for a millionth of 1 second, you let your imagination and your deepest desire. After many nights of staying away, really out of fear that his expression would be that of disdain and disgust, you decide to look in the window once again, but this time you're ready to strike. As you gather the courage to glance inside, you start to hear the music and laughter, and something inside of you melts. Your first glance ruptures something inside of you because there he is, looking in the same direction, as if he'd never taken his eyes off from that pane of glass. The expression on his face this time is so bright and full that you completely forget about everything that's ever happened to you. He gestures to you, "Come on in. We've been waiting for you." You feel the ground under you moving you in further and further until you're standing next to him, the toy maker. He puts his massive arm around you, smiles and chuckles, and says, "Welcome home." Right then, another worker asks for your help, like you've been there for 100 years. You're so intrigued by all the joyful hustle and bustle that you don't even care, that you have no idea what to do. The joy, the community, the mission inside of this store is on hyperdrive, and you just want to be a part of it, a part of something, a part of anything, something good. By this time, you've forgotten all about your wet and very dirty clothing. No one cares because there's so much work to be done. Joy is being tossed around like a football, and it's almost too much to handle. But you're now a part of this good and great work. You have moments where you glance outside into the darkness, but only after a short time of being inside the toy store. It feels like hundreds of years ago. You found your home, your people, and there's work to be done. So my point in this is there's work to be done, right? There's mission that's critical. We all feel like the orphan, that imposter, right? We would long quite often to feel like a worker bee in that beautiful toy store, being a part of this great work, right?
Yeah.
And guess what, gentlemen? We often would dare to feel like the toy maker, right? That's what our children need. And gentlemen, I'm hoping I can communicate this in some way that stirs the heart and is not some dry manual. I'm gonna give some tangible takeaways and some examples, but I want to communicate something here that would cause someone to delight in his children, right? That they would know fully that they are the object of his delight, and nothing they can do, would cause him to change the expression on his face. Welcome home. You belong here. Hey, buddy, there's work to be done. let's go. Let's get after it. There's a kingdom to be built here.
Yeah. Beautifully written and very, very evocative.
Thank you.
And does a fantastic job of illustrating that potential reality we can all tap into. So
I appreciate that.
Bravo to you, my friend.
Thanks.
I find it difficult at this point to say anything other than this has been another fantastic episode of the Emissary Authors podcast with our guest and friend, David Osk, author of the forthcoming book, The Guardians of Grit. And I am Paul Edwards, your host, along with Jason Todd, my co-host, as the Emissary Publishing Authors podcast. We will see you next time.